Have you ever wondered how close you've come to danger without even realizing it? At Shivering Vault, we take you there, one story at a time. But before you drift off, consider liking this video and commenting where you're watching from. Now, let's dive into these chilling stories. I remember the first time I hiked out in those Texas hills, far from the city, hoping to get some peace and quiet. I'd been hiking for a few hours, taking in the dry, dusty landscape and the occasional breeze that made it feel a bit cooler than it actually was. I loved that time of day when the sun starts to dip low and you're just far enough from civilization to feel like you're truly alone. I didn't expect much, just a few hours of hiking, that maybe a quick stop to take a picture of the view and then head back before nightfall. But that didn't happen. That wasn't the plan, anyway. The trail I was on was marked, but it wasn't heavily trafficked. The way it wound through some low hills and sparse trees was peaceful, and I hadn't seen another hiker all day. I'd made it a good ways up when I noticed the fog. It started out like a light haze in the air. No big deal, really, just something to brush off. But then it thickened, almost unnaturally fast. I looked around. The sky was still clear and the sun was starting to sink lower behind the hills, but the fog, this thick gray mist, just rolled in like something alive. Within minutes, I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. I should have turned back, but honestly, I thought it would clear up. I figured it was just one of those things, Texas weather, unpredictable and strange sometimes. So I kept going. I pulled my phone out to check the map, but no signal. I'd heard this part of the trail was spotty, but it still felt unnerving. A sinking feeling grew in my stomach. I started walking more cautiously, trying to remember the markers I'd passed on the trail. The fog wrapped around me in this dense, suffocating way, making it harder to focus. Every step felt more uncertain than the last, and that's when it hit me. Everything felt wrong. The air was still too like it was holding its breath. I don't know how to explain it, but the silence was too much. It wasn't like the usual quiet of the woods. It was like the world was holding a secret. My boots scraped the rocks as I walked. The only sound was the shuffle of my feet on gravel and dirt, until I heard it, the faintest sound of something else. At first, I thought it was just the wind moving through the trees. But then the noise came again, louder this time, and definitely not wind. It was rustling. Something was moving in the fog close by, just out of sight. I stopped dead in my tracks, trying to listen. It sounded like something was circling me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. My pulse started to race, and I felt that knot in my stomach that only comes when you know something's wrong, but you can't quite put your finger on what it is. For a second, I thought I imagined it, but then there it was again. A rustle, something big moving through the brush. I told myself it could just be a deer, maybe a boar. It was Texas after all. Lots of wildlife. But something in my gut told me it wasn't a deer. Then I saw them. It was just a flicker at first. A pair of eyes, glowing faintly through the fog. They weren't huge, but they were too bright in the darkness, too unnatural. I froze, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The fog was thick, but they shone through it, unmoving, like they were staring right at me. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I swear I could feel the sweat dripping down my back. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. It had to be a trick of the mist, or maybe an animal. But as I stared, I saw more pairs of eyes, glowing like little lanterns, scattered around me. It hit me all at once. There were things out there, watching me. I stepped back slowly, feeling the ground shift beneath me. I didn't want to turn and run, but every instinct in my body screamed that I should. The rustling around me intensified, like many somethings were closing in. I could hear the soft crunch of dirt and leaves, the sound of paws moving in the underbrush, getting closer, closer, closer. Then I heard it, a low, guttural growl. That was it. I turned and sprinted, my heart racing so fast I thought it would burst. My legs were screaming, and the fog was choking me, making it hard to see where I was going. The growls grew louder, and that was when I realized whatever was out there, it wasn't just one animal. It was more. A pack. I could feel their presence, the way they were moving with purpose, closing in on me. I didn't dare look back. The fog was so thick I couldn't see 5 feet in front of me, and I had no idea if I was still on the trail or just running blindly through the wilderness. My mind was a mess, just flashes of fear and instinct. The thudding of my own breath in my ears, the crackling of the ground beneath my boots, the eerie sound of multiple growls in the distance, all surrounding me. I didn't stop running, couldn't stop. My chest burned, my legs felt like lead, but I pushed myself harder. I had no idea where I was going, only that I needed to get away from whatever was out there, whatever was watching me, hunting me. And then, just as I thought I couldn't run any farther, the fog began to thin. Slowly, ever so slowly, the mist lifted. I could see shapes again, trees, rocks, the trail. My vision cleared just enough for me to spot a small clearing in the distance. Without thinking, I bolted toward it, my feet barely touching the ground. I don't know how far I ran, but I made it to the clearing, and I collapsed there, gasping for air. The fog was almost gone now, the night creeping in around me. The growling had stopped, but I still felt eyes on me. I had no idea how many of them there were or what they were. I couldn't see anything in the trees, but I knew they were still out there, just waiting. After a few minutes, I gathered enough courage to make my way back to the trail, slowly and carefully. I don't know if I've ever been more relieved to find a marked trail again. But I didn't stop running until I finally made it back to the parking lot, where a few hikers were loading up their cars. The sun had long since set, and the air was cool, but they seemed completely oblivious to what had been lurking in the mist. I was the only one who knew how close I had come to something I didn't understand. To this day, I can't help but wonder what I saw out there. I've hiked those hills many times since then, but I haven't felt safe again. Not fully. And every time I get close to that spot, I feel a strange, unshakable presence, like the mist is waiting, ready to roll in and swallow me up again. Maybe it was just a pack of coyotes. Maybe it wasn't. I'll never know for sure. But I can't shake the feeling that something out there is watching. And if you ever find yourself hiking out in those Texas hills, be careful. Keep your eyes open. You never know what's lurking just out of sight. If you do go, just don't let the fog get too thick. I've been hiking in Texas a lot. There's something about the vast, open trails that just calms me. The solitude, the silence of the woods, the smell of pine and earth, the sound of the wind rustling through the branches. It's like nature's way of resetting everything inside me. For as long as I can remember, hiking alone has been my way of finding peace, of clearing my head. The world feels so far away when you're out there, deep in the woods, with nothing but your thoughts and the trail beneath your boots. That was my mindset when I started out that morning. Just another long trek into the wilderness. Just me, my backpack, and the trail. I'd been walking for hours, the sun burning high overhead and sweat trickling down my back, but there was no place I'd rather be. The woods felt like an old friend, familiar and comforting. After a few more miles, I stumbled across the perfect spot to set up camp. A small clearing near a stream surrounded by dense trees. The sound of the water trickling over the rocks made everything feel still, like I'd found my own little sanctuary. The trees arched overhead like a protective canopy, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. It was isolated, too. No signs of human life for miles. I pitched my tent with practiced ease, the smell of the earth mixed with the faint scent of burning wood from the campfire I was about to make. The warmth of the flames, once they took hold, felt good against my tired skin after hours of hiking. I settled down on the ground beside the fire, the crackling sound of the logs filling the silence. The world seemed peaceful, almost idyllic. But there's something about being alone in the wilderness that makes the quiet unsettling. Every little noise, every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves, it all feels so much louder than it should. My mind starts to pay attention to things it would normally ignore. I tried to push it out of my head, roasting a marshmallow over the fire, watching the flame dance as the sun dipped lower behind the trees. But that's when I heard it. A faint cough. It wasn't loud, just a small, dry cough coming from somewhere out in the darkness. For a second, I thought it was just the wind, maybe the trees creaking in some strange way that made it sound like a person clearing their throat. But then I heard it again. This time my heart skipped a beat. I froze, eyes scanning the shadows beyond the firelight. I was alone. I had been for hours, and I hadn't passed a single person on the trail. There was no reason for anyone to be out here. Not for miles, at least. I turned slowly, my gaze sweeping over the edges of the clearing. The trees were thick, their trunks towering over me, casting long shadows on the ground. But there was no sign of movement. Nothing, just the stillness of the forest. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the night air. The cough came again, closer this time. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe I was just hearing things, or maybe it was an animal, right? Maybe a bobcat or something making a weird noise. My mind scrambled for an explanation. I was just being paranoid, that's all. Nothing to worry about. But my instincts were telling me otherwise. Something felt off. Then there was a sound that sent a chill up my spine, a sniffle, almost like the kind of breathing you'd hear if someone was standing just out of sight, trying to keep quiet. The wind had stopped for a moment, and in that silence, the sound was impossibly clear. It wasn't natural. It wasn't the wind, nor the stream. I sat there, frozen, my fingers tightening around the stick I'd been using to roast my marshmallow. I couldn't make sense of it. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, my heart thumping in my chest as I strained to listen. For a moment, the world felt like it was holding its breath, waiting. And then, the cough again. Closer. So close, it felt like it was coming from right at the edge of the clearing. My mind raced. Could someone be out there? Maybe someone was lost or hurt. I quickly grabbed my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. The trees seemed to swallow the light, and my eyes darted back and forth. Nothing, just shadows. I told myself it was nothing. It had to be nothing. But as the seconds passed, I felt that gnawing panic creep up my spine. I wanted to pack up and leave, but I didn't want to seem like some paranoid fool. It was stupid. It was just an animal, right? But then it came again. That cough. It was too close. I could almost feel the breath behind it, like someone standing just beyond my reach. I turned the flashlight again, heart racing, shining it in every direction. The darkness seemed to grow thicker around me, the beam barely cutting through it. My fingers were trembling, and my thoughts felt scattered. I couldn't focus. That's when I saw it. A figure. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks, some shadow from the trees. But no, it was real. A shape, motionless just beyond the trees. It stood there, barely moving, its outline obscured by the thick bark of an old oak. I couldn't see its face. I couldn't even see its body clearly, but there was something about the way it stood, so still, so deliberate, that made my stomach twist. I couldn't breathe. I shouted, my voice cracking, "Who's there?" Nothing. Silence. I stood up, legs shaking, and took a step toward the figure. My feet crunched on the dry ground as I moved, the firelight flickering behind me. My heart was pounding in my throat now. I had to know what it was. I had to know how I was imagining it. But as I stepped into the shadow of the trees, something behind me shifted. I heard a rustle, too loud to be just the wind. And then, before I could even turn around, I felt something sharp slice into my side. A searing pain shot through me, and I gasped, stumbling back. The flashlight flew from my hand, the beam scattering into the trees as it hit the ground. My breath was ragged as I tried to move, but my legs were weak, like they were made of stone. And then I heard it, a low, uneven breath. Too close, a cold press against my ribs. A knife. "Don't scream," a voice whispered, sharp and ragged, cutting through the air like a blade. The voice was so close I could feel the chill of it. It was a whisper, barely audible, but it was enough to freeze me in place. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. My body felt like it was turning to stone. The only thing I could hear was the uneven, labored breathing behind me, the soft rustling of fabric, and the dreadful certainty that I was no longer alone. The figure shifted again, moving too quickly, and in that moment, pure, unadulterated terror flooded my body. I bolted. I ran as fast as I could, every step fueled by a primal need to escape. I didn't look back, didn't dare to. The sound of footsteps behind me pushed me forward, faster than I ever thought I could run. I reached the clearing, the faint glow of my campfire just visible in the distance. I dared to glance over my shoulder. The figure wasn't following, but I didn't stop. I made it back to my camp, chest heaving, my legs burning with the effort. Without thinking, I grabbed my backpack, stuffing everything inside, clothes, gear, everything, just wanting to leave. That's when I heard it again. The cough. It came from right behind me. The voice whispered again, "You're not leaving, yet." I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. I was sure it was there, right behind me, but when I turned, there was nothing. No figure, no shape, just shadows, and the crackling of the fire. I didn't think. I didn't wait. I grabbed my pack and bolted, not looking back, not daring to stop. I ran, my lungs burning, my legs aching as I pushed through the trees. The wind whispered through the branches, but that voice, that cough, it still echoed in my head. Was I being followed? Was I still being watched? I didn't stop running until I reached the trailhead, where the trees finally broke open, and I could see the faint lights of civilization in the distance. I stopped, gasping for air, my heart still pounding in my chest. I dared to glance back. Nothing. The path was empty. No one followed me, but it didn't make me feel better. It didn't make me feel safe. The authorities didn't find anything. No sign of anyone. No sign of a struggle. No one had seen anything, but I know what I heard. I know what I felt, and sometimes even now I can still hear that cough, that whisper. It's always there in the back of my mind. This all started when I decided to take a solo hiking trip out in the Texas Hill Country. I'd been wanting to get away from the noise of everyday life for a while, just needed some space to clear my head. I'm not the most experienced hiker, but I'd done a couple of easy trails before, and this one seemed like it would be a good challenge for the day. It was a beautiful morning when I set off. The sun was still low in the sky, casting a golden light over the rugged terrain. The air was warm but not too hot, just perfect for hiking. I didn't plan on going too far, maybe a few miles up one of the easier trails, then loop back around and head home. But things didn't go as planned. About 2 hours into my hike, I noticed something strange. I was walking along the trail, which had gotten a little rougher, and I hadn't passed another soul for what felt like forever. It wasn't unusual to feel a little isolated out there, but the silence was unsettling. Normally, you hear the birds or the wind rustling through the trees, but this felt still. That's when I saw them. 2 men, dressed in park ranger uniforms, were standing near the trail ahead of me. I hadn't heard them coming, which made me feel uneasy. They were just there. They looked normal enough at first, tall, wearing the standard green and tan park ranger gear, and carrying what I assumed were radios clipped to their belts. They were standing side by side, almost like they were waiting for me. Their faces didn't seem particularly friendly, but they weren't threatening either. Still, I felt a tightness in my chest. As I approached, one of them gave me a quick nod, then spoke in a low voice, almost like he was trying to sound casual. Hey there, you're going to want to turn back. There's been an incident up ahead. I stopped dead in my tracks. An incident? I asked, my heart suddenly racing. I didn't know what that could mean, but it sounded serious. The other ranger, who hadn't said anything yet, finally spoke up. Yeah, it's best if you head back down the trail now. Just follow us for a while and we'll show you the safest way. Now, I'm not one to panic, but something about their tone made me feel off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but they didn't seem like the friendly rangers you'd expect in a national park. There was a stiffness to their movements, and they were standing just a little too close to each other. Maybe it was just my imagination, but I didn't get the sense that they were concerned for me. They were more like hurting me. I asked them what kind of incident it was. They just looked at each other, and the first ranger shrugged. Best not to worry about it. Just follow us and we'll make sure you get out of here, okay? At this point, I should have just turned around and left. But something kept me there, and honestly, I was kind of scared. I didn't want to be caught out there alone if something was wrong. So I decided to follow them. I figured they were park rangers, after all. They knew the land better than I did, and I trusted them. Or at least I thought I did. We started walking down the trail together, the rangers leading the way. For a while, everything was normal. The trail was still quiet, but I could hear the occasional snap of a branch underfoot. The rangers didn't talk much, just kept moving forward at a steady pace. I asked again what happened, but they didn't respond. The silence was deafening, and I felt that creeping unease start to gnaw at me. After about 15 minutes, we reached a part of the trail where it split into two different paths. The rangers paused for a moment, like they were deciding which way to go. Then, one of them, let's call him Ranger 1, turned to me and said, "We're going to take this way." That's when I noticed something that made my stomach flip. Ranger 1's badge didn't have a name on it. I don't know why it took me this long to see it, but when I looked closer, I realized that both of their badges were blank. No names, no titles, nothing. Just a blank silver plate where the details should have been. I froze. I don't know why it didn't register with me earlier, but now I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I stared at them both for a long moment. Their uniforms seemed off too. The stitching on the sleeves was too neat, like it had never been worn before. Their hats looked like they hadn't seen a speck of dust. It was just too perfect, like something out of a bad movie. I took a step back, suddenly feeling like I was in the middle of a bad dream. I wanted to ask more questions, but my voice felt stuck in my throat. "We can show you the way," Ranger 1 said again, his voice almost too calm. "Just come with us and you'll be fine." I shook my head, suddenly terrified. I don't think I'm going with you. I'll just head back on my own." Ranger 1 didn't say anything. Instead, he reached out, grabbing my arm with an unsettling grip. I jerked away instinctively. "No, let go of me." For a second, I thought I was just overreacting. But when I tried to pull away again, Ranger 1's hand stayed firm on my arm. His fingers felt cold, too cold, and I could feel a sickening pressure building up. The silence between us felt thick and suffocating. Without thinking, I broke free, yanking my arm out of his grip. My heart was pounding now, and I didn't wait around to see what would happen next. I turned and ran. I didn't care where. I just wanted to get as far away from those two as possible. I heard them shout something behind me, but I didn't dare look back. My only thought was to get down to the parking lot and leave, fast. I don't know how long I ran, but when I finally made it back to the parking area, I was out of breath, shaking. I tried to calm down, telling myself that maybe I had just imagined the whole thing, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. I went to the ranger station as soon as I could. I tried to explain what happened, but when I mentioned the two rangers who had stopped me, the staff gave me the strangest look. The guy behind the counter asked me to wait for a minute, and then he came back with another ranger. "Can you describe these rangers?" he asked. I told him what I could remember: the uniforms, the blank badges, their cold grip, the whole thing. He just shook his head. "No one was sent out on that trail today. We don't have anyone out there right now." My stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" "There were 2 rangers. I saw them." The ranger behind the desk gave me a weird, uncomfortable look, like he wasn't sure what to say next. "Are you sure you're okay?" he asked. I left right after that. The rest of the day is a blur. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, but I didn't know what. I've been back to that trail a few times since then, but every time I walk past that split where I saw them, I can't help but feel like someone's watching me. I don't know if it was some kind of bizarre prank or something darker, but I don't ever want to go near that place again. It's been months, and I still can't get it out of my head. Those rangers didn't look right. They didn't feel right. And the worst part? I have no idea what they wanted from me. I'd been hiking in the Texas wilderness many times before. Not the most dangerous or challenging trails, but I knew the landscape well enough to feel comfortable out there, even when I was alone. There's something deeply freeing about being out in the wild, just you and nature, away from the hum of the world. I could leave my phone behind, forget about work, forget about anything that tied me to the hustle. It's the kind of quiet that settles in your bones, and for a guy like me, it felt like a privilege. This trip was no different. It was late spring, the weather warm but not unbearable. Perfect hiking weather. I set up camp about 5 miles in on a trail I knew like the back of my hand. The sun was already dipping behind the hills, casting long shadows across the trees. The area was remote enough that I wouldn't be bothered by anyone, which is exactly what I was hoping for. I wasn't particularly worried about my campsite, just pitched my tent in a clearing, made a small fire, and settled in for a quiet evening. I had a good book, a few snacks, and even a couple of beers for good measure. I watched the colors in the sky fade from gold to deep purple, feeling the slow quiet of the night as it crept in. The fire crackled softly, sending occasional sparks into the air, and for a while, that was all there was. It was peaceful, perfectly peaceful. But that's when it started. Around midnight, the wind picked up, nothing too unusual. The air was still warm, but carried that coolness that comes with the night. The trees rustled, and I half closed my eyes, listening to the familiar sounds of the wilderness. The distant hoot of an owl, the chirp of crickets, the gentle rustling of leaves. I leaned back in my camping chair, sipping my beer, feeling the calmness of the moment. Then, something changed. The wind grew stronger, but oddly enough, the sounds from the forest didn't. It's hard to describe, but the silence that followed was deafening. I glanced around, trying to make sense of it. The fire was burning low now, and I had the sudden, almost compulsive urge to stoke it, to toss in another log and keep the warmth and light going. But as I stood up, a strange sensation gripped me. My chest tightened, and I felt this subtle but unmistakable pressure in the air, like something was just off. I paused, scanning the trees around me, the darkness creeping in from all sides. But there was nothing. The shadows seemed to stretch further than normal, like they were swallowing the light of the fire. Still, nothing moved. The night was unnaturally still, too still. I shook it off, telling myself it was just the isolation, the silence getting to me. So I crawled back into my tent, zipped it up, and tried to relax. I'd be fine. It was probably nothing. But then I noticed something that didn't belong. The smell. It wasn't anything overt, nothing rotten or overtly foul, but it was unsettling. It was sour, musty, like damp earth, and something I couldn't quite place. It reminded me of old, decaying leaves in a swamp, but sharper, heavier, more pungent. I sat up, my heart starting to thud in my chest. I tried to rationalize it, tell myself it was just the forest, maybe the wind had blown something from the brush near my camp, but it didn't sit right. It didn't feel like nature. The tent around me was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the fire outside. I stared at the flap for a moment, half expecting to see someone, or something, standing just outside, watching. But nothing was there. Just the fire flickering and crackling in the distance. Yet the unease remained, growing heavier as the minutes ticked by. I told myself to just sleep, that I was overthinking it, and pulled my sleeping bag tighter around me. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the strange sensation creeping along my spine. I needed rest. An hour passed, or maybe 2, I'm not sure, but I woke suddenly. It wasn't a gradual stirring from sleep. It was more like I had been yanked out of a deep, dreamless slumber. I blinked in confusion, trying to reorient myself in the darkness, but something felt wrong. The air was colder now, and the silence was even thicker than before, like the whole world was holding its breath. I reached for the zipper of the tent and pulled it open, thinking I could just take a quick look around. But before I could even poke my head out, I froze. There was a sound, but not from the forest. This sound was too close, too deliberate. Heavy, slow footsteps, crunching through the underbrush, my breath hitched in my throat, my pulse spiking. I was sure it wasn't an animal. It didn't have the erratic rhythm of a deer or the cautious steps of a boar. No, these were human footsteps, and they were deliberate, controlled. It sounded like someone was walking slowly, purposefully, like they knew I was there and didn't care. I lay still, my heartbeat loud in my ears, barely breathing. The sound was coming closer. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. I held my breath, trying to steady my thoughts. Maybe it was just a hiker. Maybe someone else had come out here for the night. But deep down, I knew that wasn't right. Something about the way the person moved, it didn't feel natural. Then, just like that, the footsteps stopped. I thought maybe I'd imagined it, that maybe I was just on edge. But when I looked through the flap again, my blood ran cold. A shadow stood near the fire, barely visible in the low glow of the embers. The shape was tall, unnaturally tall, and broad. The way it stood, it felt wrong. Not just the size, but the posture. There was something off about the way it held itself, like it wasn't quite human. The figure didn't move at first. It just stood there watching the fire, and I couldn't tear my eyes away. My pulse thundered in my ears as I tried to steady my breathing. But then it moved. Slowly. Too slowly. It took one deliberate step toward my tent. I scrambled for my pocket knife, my hands trembling, not even sure what I was going to do with it. The figure was close now, too close, and I could see more details in the flickering light. It was huge, tall, with a broad frame that seemed to block out the light. The movements were unsettling, unnatural. It wasn't quite human, and I could feel it. My mind screamed at me to do something, anything. Suddenly the tent was struck, slammed from the outside. I didn't have time to react. The sound was so sudden, so violent, it felt like the entire world had exploded around me. I screamed without thinking, the panic rushing in like a wave, but almost as soon as I did, I regretted it. The figure's hands scraped across the side of the tent, like it was searching for me, feeling its way along the fabric. I could hear its breathing, deep, slow, deliberate. Every exhale sent a chill down my spine. My heart pounded in my chest, my entire body frozen. Then, that hand reached under the flap, grabbing my wrist with a grip so strong I thought my bones would snap. The skin was rough, calloused, and it reeked of decay, of something worse than dirt. I didn't think. I just reacted. With every ounce of strength I could muster, I swung my knife blindly, hoping to strike something, anything. The figure didn't let go. It yanked me toward the flap, dragging me toward the opening. I fought with everything I had, kicking, screaming, desperate to break free. Finally, with one last burst of strength, I managed to push the hand away and tumble out of the tent. I didn't stop running. I didn't even think to look back. I just ran. fast, hard, through the trees, through the rocks, the underbrush, tearing at my legs. My breath came in gasps, my heart racing in my chest, but I didn't dare slow down. It felt like I ran for miles. My body burned, my legs ached, but I didn't stop until I hit the main trail again, the familiar path leading back toward the parking lot. My chest felt like it was going to explode, but I didn't stop running until I saw my truck. I collapsed in the dirt, gasping for air. The next morning, I went back with the police, hoping to find something, anything, that could explain what had happened. But when we reached the spot, there was nothing. The fire was out, the ashes cold and dark. My tent was gone. All my gear, gone. As if it had never been there. The police thought I was disoriented. They chalked it up to exhaustion, maybe even animals tearing my campsite apart. But there was no sign of struggle, no tracks, no footprints, no evidence at all that anything had happened. To this day, I don't know what I encountered out there. I don't know if it was a person or something else. But I know this, the woods have their secrets, and I'll never step foot in them again. That's it for today's tale from Shivering Vault. If you have a story worth sharing, drop it in the comments or send it our way. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your fellow thrill seekers. As always, the Shivering Vault thanks you for unlocking today's tale. Until next time, the vault awaits your return.